Well, thank you, praise team, George, who's been here from the very beginning, very first Apprentice Gathering. George, we're saying good things about you. Yeah, he's too humble. Well, it's wonderful to gather again this morning. Did you have a good sleep? Good rest? I prayed that you would. So you're welcome. Yeah. Thanks, Bill. Appreciate that. I woke up this morning, and I love when I wake up with this prayer. And the prayer was this. It was, "Come, my sons and daughters, listen to me. Come to the Lord and be enlightened." That's what we've come for. We've come for that. And today, we get to hear from RHB and JMC. Ruth Haley Barton this morning, John Mark Comer this afternoon, and I'm so excited to hear from both of them. Ruth has been doing amazing work in spiritual formation. I would say she's a matriarch, but that makes us feel old when you say words like matriarch, right? But she has been doing this fantastic work through the Transforming Center, and her books are fantastic. Her latest book, Embracing Rhythms of Work and Rest, is wonderful, and I think she'll talk some about that. She's just, when I think of a teacher of spiritual formation, she comes to mind. When I think, who do I want to teach about spiritual formation? It's Ruth Haley Barton. And as Ruth likes to say, she and I, we run in the same orbit, but are seldom in the same room. So it's fun when we are. We had the last time we were was when she was here. Before that, we were at a conference in Denver. I reminded Ruth of this morning. It was downtown Denver. There was a lot of traffic. Ruth was trying to cross the street, and I yelled at her as she was about to get hit by a car. So I saved Ruth Haley Barton's life, and she owes me. I remind her of that. So I'm so excited. I'm not going to take any more of her time. Please welcome to the stage Dr. Ruth Haley Barton.
Oh, good morning. Well, there's one more Jim and Ruth story that I could share, and that is at Renovari a number of years ago when we were honoring Dallas Willard. And the organizers had this idea that we would have different decades of people get up and just represent for a few minutes something that they had experienced from Dallas Willard. So there were like 5 categories or something like that, Jim, and one of the categories was next gen. And Jim and I got put in the next gen category, and we're in our 50s, and I'm like, I haven't been in a next gen category for so long, I don't even know what to do with myself right here. But anyway, there we were, and I guess we are, so what can you say? As we begin today, and it's very, very good to be with you, Jim reminded me that I had been here, I think, at the second Apprentice Gathering, so it's been a long time, and I'm glad to be back in the room here with you. Barbara Brown Taylor, in her book, An Altar in the World, she writes of being asked by a wise old priest to come speak at his church in Alabama. And she said, well, what do you want me to speak about? And he says, well, come and speak to us about what is saving your life these days. I want to just let that question hang for a minute and let you ask it and answer it, or at least write it down for reflection later. What is saving your life these days? That's a powerful question. That's a spiritual director type question. What is saving your life these days? Well, I guess you could say that I'm here today to tell you what is saving my life these days. And it is unequivocally the Sabbath. I am quite certain that I would not be here standing before you today if it were not for God's gift of Sabbath, and not just a weekly Sabbath day, but also daily Sabbath moments cultivated in solitude and silence, and sabbatical seasons for letting the soil of my soul lie fallow. These rhythms have given shape and form to a life, my life. My life as a creature lived in the presence of my Creator, and these Sabbath rhythms have quite literally kept me in the game. But as you know, if you've read any of my work, you know that I've not always lived this way. My wake-up call regarding God's gift of Sabbath for me came when I was in my early 40s. Serving on a staff at a very high-performance church culture. I was married with 3 busy children. I was writing, I was teaching, and guiding others in spiritual practices, but I can tell you that the Sabbath was the one that I was actively resisting. I was doing all the other stuff, but Sabbath, I just couldn't see a way to fit it into my life. I mean, I knew Sabbath was a thing, I had been raised in a home where I was a pastor's kid, and so we practiced Sabbath, but in a very legalistic way. And now I was too busy and too important and too caught in cultural expectations to consider ceasing my work one day a week and resting myself in God. Grandiosity, that is grandiosity at its best. And then in addition to my grandiosity, which was a sin, the logistics of family life and work made it seem impossible to practice this wonderful discipline. It was just outside my reach. Sunday was the only day that it would have been even possible for our family, our very busy family, to have a Sabbath, and yet I was on a church staff, so Sundays were a very busy day for us. My husband's place of work was open on Sundays, and all of it just seemed to prevent any consideration of Sabbath keeping. But the deeper truth is that I just wasn't attracted to the concept at the time. I had been raised in a fundamentalist environment, and we had kept the Sabbath, but it was very legalistic, and so for me, Sabbath was a very joyless day of contradictions. We went to church in the morning. All of us little children sat on the front row while my dad preached, and we behaved ourselves, or tried, or got in trouble at home if we didn't behave ourselves. And then because we were the pastor's family, we would always have people over, and guess who were the busiest people on that particular occasion? The women were. So I'd be there helping my mom. We worked very, very hard because our gender stereotypes were very well in play. The men would get to sit in the living room and have their coffee and talk theology, and I would be serving right alongside my mother. So that was not restful or delightful at all. Some of you remember this. Some of you, I can see the demographic here, some of you remember days like that. Added to that was that as I became a young adult, I realized that Sunday was a really, really good day for just catching up on things. As a student, it was a really good day for studying. As somebody who was a working mom, it was a really good day for making up for everything that didn't get done throughout the week. And honestly, I was just glad to not be under my parents' roof and to kick that particular practice to the curb, and that is what I did until my early 40s. But then, years later, I realized that after years of serving the Lord without any breaks at all, and allowing my overachieving ways to drive my lifestyle, I began to acknowledge a level of exhaustion in my life that I wasn't quite sure what to do with. And I also, at that time, started to engage in a guilty pleasure. And that guilty pleasure was reading beautiful books about the Sabbath. And I mean, other people might have more exciting ones, but this was mine. And I would read books. No one knew I was reading these books. I would allow the longing for a way of life that worked to well up within me. I would live inside the fantasy just for a little while, and then I would set the book aside as a private indulgence that was full of pleasures I could imagine for others, but not for myself. And I kept my explorations personal and private because I wanted to dream without interruption, at least for a little while. I didn't want any of those naysayers telling me that Sabbath keeping was impossible. I wanted to live inside the dream just for a little while. By this time, I had been to seminary, and I understood the basic hermeneutical principle that if you want to know what matters to God, you look for the great themes of Scripture. And you look for the arc, if you will. And the way I saw it, the theme of Sabbath and rest was a vibrant thread running throughout the Scriptures. And I had no patience for theologically resistant folks raising questions about whether or not Sabbath keeping is for today and why didn't Jesus teach about it and all that. To my knowledge, God had never taken back the gift of the Sabbath, and it was one of the 10 Commandments after all, and the best one, if you ask me now. It seemed to me that when Jesus was on the earth, he didn't teach about Sabbath because why? Because he practiced it. He was a practicing Jew, and as a practicing Jew, he practiced Sabbath. He didn't need to teach about it. He just practiced it, and he just modeled it for all of us. Now, there were moments when he reframed it just a little bit to make it a little bit more relevant to some of the questions that were being asked of him. And he actually established himself as Lord of the Sabbath. Can I get an amen? Lord of the Sabbath. That means I get to define it, right? I get to define it for now because I'm Lord of the Sabbath. His actions on the Sabbath bothered everybody else, but he said, no, I'm Lord of the Sabbath. I know what this day's about. I'm going to show you what this day's about by what I do on the Sabbath. So to me, it was something that was in the life of Jesus, so any sort of real discipleship would have to involve Sabbath keeping in my mind. And so while I longed for this kind of rest, the rest that I saw in the Sabbath practice, I was completely convinced of its importance, biblically speaking, but I did not want to wrestle with all the complications that Sabbath keeping would bring to my life. However, just knowing that somebody somewhere was able to figure out how to live a Sabbath, somehow it just lit my soul up from the inside, and yet it still felt impossible for me. And then, as many of you will know, I had a biking accident. I don't know what the theme is here with getting run over by. It's really clearly dangerous for me to walk or ride a bike. But here I was riding a bike on this day. And on this particular day, I won't tell the whole story here because I tell it at length in Sacred Rhythms. But on this day, I had a biking accident. I was riding along on a sidewalk. There was an elderly man who was pulling out of a parking lot. He didn't give me the right of way. I didn't see that he was struggling early enough to stop my bike, and so he ran into me. I fell to the ground. The vehicle ran up over my legs, which were still entwined in the bike, and I'm sitting there praying. It was a moment of utter clarity. Sometimes you think you might pass out in a moment like this, but I did not. It was a moment of utter clarity where I thought to myself, wow, I hope he gets this off me soon because this really hurts. I was literally thinking that kind of a thought while I was laying there. And he put it into reverse and got the bike off my legs. And by God's grace, there were some off-duty paramedics driving by, and they saw what had happened, and they came and scooped me up off the pavement, and off we went to the hospital. But it was during the time of my recovery that God began to speak to me more clearly about the Sabbath. Because here's the truth. After the euphoria sort of wore off and I was just grateful for having survived such a thing, I went back to work the next day. And as this relief gave way to other levels of awareness, God used a couple of comments to help me to ponder the state of my life. One of my friends, after expressing his initial concern, laughingly commented, "Ruth, when are you going to learn that when you're on a bike, you can't take on a van?" See, a metaphor there for my whole life, right there. Another friend who was really curious about the fact that I went back to work right away, she said, you did just get run over by a car. You could take a day off. And so God began to speak to me about the way I was living my life. And I did then end up taking some time off because there was some post-traumatic stress that kicked in and things like that. And there was a line from Wayne Mueller's beautiful book, Sabbath, that just kept buzzing around in my head like a fly buzzing on a window pane. He says that if we do not allow for a rhythm of rest in our overly busy lives, illness becomes our Sabbath. Our pneumonia, our cancer, our heart attack, our accidents create Sabbath for us. Boom. God had me right there. I did not want to hear this. I did not want to consider the fact that perhaps this accident, while not caused by God, was a way in which God was trying to get my attention. I did not want to acknowledge the possibility that it might be that hard for God to get my attention, nor did I want to face the fact that for years I had been thumbing my nose at human limitations, behaving as though I was beyond needing a Sabbath. For me, it was a nice idea for retired people, for people who weren't very important, people who weren't very busy, but I wasn't one who needed a Sabbath. And I was strong. Look, I had a car run over me. I'm still here. So I felt myself to be young and strong, and I just didn't think I needed it. And that is how God began nudging me, though, by getting me some quiet so that I could go down to the depths of my desire about a need for a way of life that worked. God used my accident to stop me in my tracks and to provide the right kind of space to really consider the reality of my human limitations and the layers of exhaustion that existed within me. And so I do believe that God used that moment in my life to begin to draw my attention to the Sabbath in a more concrete way, but also to help me to get in touch with the desire and to let that desire get big inside me and to lead me into something that I knew I really, really wanted. And so I believe God used that time and has moved me now from those delicious Sabbath moments that I would consider to be solitude and silence. And that's where I first started to experience rest in God, by the way, is when I would begin cultivating solitude as a place of rest in God first. And those of you who have read Invitation to Solitude and Silence know that that's a good part of that book, is how to experience, cultivate solitude and silence as a place of rest in God. And I was experiencing that. And now I understood that there was more, and that the Sabbath could follow on quite naturally from my practice of solitude and silence. And now I am here before you today, able to testify that God's gift of Sabbath is far more than just one day a week. It is actually a way of life that is ordered around this day. And in fact, Sabbath is a practice that saves my life week after week after week after week. Sabbath keeping is a way of ordering all of life around a pattern of working 6 days and then ceasing and resting on the seventh. And I'm trying to keep ceasing and resting together because the original languages contain this idea of ceasing. And of course, you can't rest until you cease, right? There's got to be some things you stop before you can actually rest. Sabbath helps us to arrange our lives around the original order of things, the rhythm of things, work and rest, fruitfulness and dormancy, giving and receiving, being and doing, activism and surrender. The day itself is set apart, yes, devoted completely to rest, worship, and delight. But the other 6 days of the week must be lived in such a way as to make a Sabbath possible. And so paid work needs to be contained within 5 days. The 6th day needs to be held for the work of being human, dry cleaning and washing the car and going shopping and all of that. The 6th day is really, really important to the 7th day. There's no way to get the 7th day if you don't do the 6th day right. Amen. So all that stuff needs to be done on the 6th day so that we can enter into the 7th day. Courageous decisions have to be made all the way around about work and athletics, church and community involvement. But this pattern of tithing 1/7 of our time back to God is woven deep into our Christian tradition. And in fact, it goes all the way back to God. It does not go back to the Jews. It goes all the way back to God. It is a rhythm that God built into God's very existence. And in the New Testament, we're told that we can become partakers of the divine nature. And I think that practicing Sabbath is one way that we partake in the divine nature. God's very nature is to take a rest on the 7th day. The one who doesn't need it actually built a rhythm of rest into his creativity and work. And so we are participating in God's very nature when we practice Sabbath keeping. The practice of keeping the Sabbath holy and completely set apart was and still is at the heart of the Jewish tradition and ethnic identity. Because as Abraham Heschel said, it was as if a whole people were in love with the 7th day. There's emotion attached to this day, love and longing and gratitude and delight. But it didn't start with them. It started with God, and when God called a people to himself, he said, I have this really cool thing I want to share with you. I want to share the Sabbath with you. And so I have experienced this love and this delight in my life. I've been practicing for over 20 years now. I have experienced this love of Sabbath myself in the joy and relief that washes over me when Sabbath comes, when the house has been prepared, when special food has been bought, when computers have been shut down and cell phones are turned off, when those final emails have been sent, when work obligations have been completed or set aside, and sometimes they have to be set aside, they won't get completed before the Sabbath, when the candles or the fireplace have been lit and it is time to stop, when everything has been finished or not. And I know what it's like to love that day. I know what it's like to rest for hours until I have the energy to delight in something. Savory food, a good book, a leisurely walk, a long-awaited conversation with someone I love. I know what it's like to feel joy and hope and peace flow back into my body and soul when I thought it might never come again. I know what it's like to see home and family, friends and community differently through the Sabbath eyes of delight in God's good gifts, those gifts that money cannot buy. I know what it's like to experience rest, turning into delight, turning into gratitude, turning into worship. I know what it is like to recover myself so completely that I'm able, by God's grace, to enter back into my work with a renewed sense of God's calling and God's presence in my work, a renewed sense of partnership with God in my work. How could you not love a day that does all that? How could you not love a God who would think to give his dear beloved children a gift like this and to build it into the rhythms of our lives? How could you not sell everything you have for this pearl of great price? And I want you to feel that. I'm really leaving space so that you can just feel the questions. How could you not love a God who would give you that? How could you not love a day like that? How could you not enter in with all your might because you've been given such a great gift? Well, it's hard, and I want to say that even with a vision cast like that, I know that Sabbath keeping is probably one of the most challenging, if not the most challenging, of the spiritual practices. And I've come to talk about it as a practice that takes practice. The Sabbath is a practice that takes practice because it does not come naturally to us at all. We have our human reasons. As humans, we're not naturally very good at this. It's very counterintuitive to think that we might get enough done if we take a seventh day to cease our work. For us as humans, we are so used to imposing our will on the world 7 days a week through human striving, hard work. And this wiring, actually, I will say, goes back to our creation. God gave us those things to do. At creation, God said to the man and the woman, you're to be fruitful and multiply and have dominion over the earth, right? So God built that impulse in us to want to be productive and to want to subdue the earth and to want to have dominion in the appropriate way. But it gets more interesting when you put the Sabbath command right there in the context of that original creation mandate. That God is saying, okay, but hold up a minute, because I think this could probably get out of hand, because I know you really well. It might get out of hand, so I'm giving you the Sabbath right here. 6 days, you're supposed to do all that, and the seventh day, I'm telling you this is what will be best for you. So from a human point of view, it's not easy. We're addicted to control and productivity and human striving. We would rather rely on ourselves than God 7 days a week. It is really hard to say, God, I've imposed myself and my will on the world for 6 days. Now I'm going to trust you, and I'm going to let you have complete control over my world. So we would prefer to live life on our terms rather than submit ourselves to a practice that enables us to become children again and to rest in our loving parents' arms. It's hard for us culturally because right now there's nothing in our culture that supports a Sabbath practice. I think we all remember days when the whole culture would shut down and stores wouldn't be open and nobody would even think of playing sports on Sundays or buying things on Sundays. And it was part of even the secular culture to hold Sundays as a special day, but that's gone. And of course, now we're in a place where everything is available to us every day. And so Michael Zigarelli, who's a professor from Charleston University of Business, he identified, and I think this is so interesting, he identified in a study of 20,000 Christians around the world that there is a vicious cycle that characterizes even our lives as Christians, and he calls it a place of cultural conformity. Here's the cycle. That Christians are assimilating to a culture of busyness, hurry, and overload, which leads to, number 2, God being marginalized in Christians' lives, which leads to 3, a deteriorating relationship with God, which leads to 4, Christians becoming even more vulnerable to adopting secular assumptions about how to live, which leads to, number 5, more conformity to a culture of busyness, hurry, and overload. Have you ever thought of your busyness as being a place of cultural conformity? And that if we as Christians refused to conform to the culture in this way, we would be a witness to something that's bigger than ourselves and bigger than our culture, bigger than everything that drives us? So there are cultural reasons why this is hard, but it doesn't mean that we should ignore the invitation. And so if we see our busyness and our 24/7 lifestyles as being a place of cultural conformity, we could even see Sabbath then as a place where we're confronting culture and challenging culture and saying, you do not own me. And then finally, it's difficult for spiritual reasons. You wouldn't think it would be true, but Sabbath keeping is challenging for spiritual reasons. Because on the Sabbath, we are proclaiming our allegiance to God and God's kingdom. Woo! Wow. On the Sabbath, we're proclaiming our allegiance to God and God's kingdom. According to Exodus 31, the Sabbath is a sign and perpetual witness that God is our God, that God has redeemed us to live on God's terms for us. And so I've come to see Sabbath as being almost like displaying a flag, as a form of allegiance to God. In our culture, when we proclaim allegiance to our country, we plant a flag in our front yard. But on the Sabbath, we're saying that regardless of whatever geographical country we are from, wherever our citizenship is on this earth, God is our ultimate allegiance, and we live our lives on God's terms. The Sabbath is God's day, and it's to be experienced as God ordained it. So on the Sabbath, there's a real sense in which, once again, I am pledging my allegiance to God, and I'm saying to God, even though I live and work here, my allegiance, my faithful service is to you, and I'm going to do life on your terms for me. So I wanted to mention the challenges because I had to face them all myself when I first began to practice. So there we are. We have some challenges, but we also have a vision. And so now I'd like to talk about Sabbath in terms of the gift that it is that God intends for us. And I've come to believe that the beauty of the Sabbath is in the rhythm. So when we were working on the titling for Embracing Rhythms of Work and Rest, we had a whole lot of titles about Sabbath and resting. And I said, no, I want the word rest in there because I want to acknowledge the fact that our work is good too. I don't want to set up this false dichotomy between rest and work. Rest is not better than work, and work is not better than rest. It is the rhythm between the two that makes both good. I value work. I know that work is a place of deep communion with God if we know how to experience it that way. If we know how to experience our work as a place of partnership with God, there's great goodness there. There's great intimacy with God to be had there. And then there is the rhythm of rest that makes it also beautiful. I wanted to shatter false dichotomies or false dualities between work and rest. And I wanted to be very sure, even in the title, that we were communicating that there's goodness in both of them and that it is the rhythm between the two that is beautiful. Work gives meaning to our rest because without work, rest would turn to laziness. But without rest, we would miss out on the chance to step back and to look at what we've accomplished, how we've worked this week, and to call it good. So the goodness is in the rhythm. So I want to talk then about some of the more specific gifts of Sabbath, and I'm thinking about this a little bit like a gift basket. Have you ever received a gift basket from somebody who knows you really, really well and has picked out all these amazing things and put them in the basket? So if you're a woman who likes baths, then, you get the beautiful soap, and you get the candle, and you get, you get it all, and it's all in there. And every time you pick out a new part of the gift, you're like, ooh, wow. So I think I might do a little bit of audience participation here. We might do a little bit of wooing and eyeing as we move through the gifts of Sabbath. So now I want to look at the Sabbath not just as this big general gift, but as a gift basket that has many gifts in it that are particularly well chosen for us, the people that God loves. All right? All right. So the first gift I want to mention, of course, is the obvious one, and that is the gift of rest. Yes, ooh, the gift of rest. How many of us need that one today? Let's take it out of the basket and say, I love this. Rather than the Hebrew word manuka is used to fully describe this thing that is hard for us to actually capture in our own words, but the word manuka means joy, delight, tranquility, and shalom. So it's not just physical rest, but it's also this rest for the soul, a time to experience peace in our souls, tranquility in our souls, gratitude in our souls, delight in our souls. And it means that we abstain from any kind of productive activity, because the principle here is that it's not about the activity so much, it's about whether it's work for me. So on the Sabbath, when we're trying to figure out what we're going to do and what we're not going to do, you really need to be in touch with what is work for you and what is not work for you. Because if it is maluka, which is work, it violates the restful intent of Sabbath time to recognize and rely on God as our ultimate provider. So this first gift is definitely the gift of ceasing and rest, and you have to cease in order to rest. And in the Jewish tradition, there's a primary metaphor that is used. It's the metaphor of a groom preparing the bridal chamber. Wow. And I'll take a moment to think about that and the specialness of that occasion. And so the Jewish people actually imbued this specialness to the Sabbath. And of course, that day of preparation then speaks to the preparation that a groom would do to prepare for the bridal chamber. And so we prepare. That's why we prepare. We don't go off half ready. We actually prepare for the Sabbath. And we've already talked about the fact that receiving this gift of the seventh day means that we must be very intentional with the sixth day. Now, I know for sure that if we are in our child-raising years, that our lives are very, very full and there are unique challenges. And that's why I do address in the book different stages of family life and human life, because the Sabbath is not going to look the same for you if you have young children in the home as it does for me now that all my children are gone. But I was practicing when I had a whole house full of children and all their friends on some days. So I know whereof I speak, and I know that it is possible for that seventh day to be a gift of ceasing and rest if we are intentional about it. So, the gift of ceasing and rest. Ooh, yeah. Secondly, the gift of trust. Ooh, the gift of trust. That what I have accomplished in 6 days is enough, that I can trust God's provision rather than always having to trust myself. You remember that when the Sabbath was given to the Israelites, it was all about trusting God's provision in the wilderness. You remember that, right? And there was this exercise that they had to go through where God said, I'm going to provide you with manna on every day of the week, the 6 days, but on the sixth day, you're supposed to gather twice as much, and then on the seventh day, you won't have to work. Well, I'm telling you, this was a really hard concept for the Israelites. And it took them a while. It took them practice. In fact, they messed it up in the beginning because they just couldn't understand that they were supposed to be trusting God and that God was trustworthy. All right? So the pattern of trusting God one day a week is built into the Sabbath rhythm. It is about trust in a very deep way. But eventually, even though they got it wrong before they got it right, eventually, with strong guidance from their anointed leader, and by the way, I do think there is a real role for leaders to play, for pastors and leaders to play in bringing Sabbath to their communities. And in fact, in the book, I talk about leadership for Sabbath communities, because I think communities are so important to the practice of Sabbath. It's really hard to do it when you don't have anybody else who's practicing with you. That's why it worked for the Israelites, is because they were all doing it together. And so there's a place for Sabbath leadership. There's a place for leading Sabbath communities intentionally. But that's an aside for right now. What I want to say here, though, is that even though they got it wrong in their first attempts, with strong guidance from their anointed leader, they did get it right eventually. And eventually it became one of the defining characteristics of their identity as a people, their practice of Sabbath, which was a practice of trust. So sometimes I've wondered, who would we be? Who would we be as a community of faith? Who would we be as individuals if we trusted like that once a week? And here I want to place the Sabbath squarely in the discipline and the practice of spiritual formation, because Sabbath keeping is a formational discipline. Now, Bob Mulholland says that everything is formational. The only question is whether or not it's transformational, deformational. So I'm here to say that Sabbath keeping is a transformational discipline. And by definition, spiritual disciplines open us to the work that only God can do. By definition, that's what a spiritual practice is. It's a way of opening to God, something I can do concretely that opens me up to something that only God can do. And I am telling you, friends, on the Sabbath, God does things in me that I could never do for myself. And I wouldn't even know to do them. See, that's the thing. On the Sabbath, I trust myself to God, and I say, God, I'm all yours today. Whatever needs to be done in my life, you will have to do it. And so Sabbath keeping, not as an option or a lifestyle suggestion, but as a command, as a gift, and also as a transformational process if we are open to what God might want to do in our lives there. So who would we be? Who would you be? Who would I be if we trusted like that one day a week? So the gift of trust, perfectly suited for what we need. Another gift, the gift of delight. And this is a big one. When was the last time you created a day that was only about what you delight in? All right? Just picking all the things that you love to do, picking all the things you love to eat, picking all the people you want to be with. For me, let me just tell you one thing about my Sabbath. The best thing for me on any day is a day that has no schedule. I'm a flaming pea on the Myers-Briggs, and most of the rest of my life is lived in a very structured, scheduled way, and I drive everybody nuts with how hard it is for me to live in this way. But on the Sabbath, one of the most important things for me is that it's a day that does not have a schedule and it can unfold. That is delight for me. I can lay on my couch under a blanket and read a book for as long as I want. When I'm done reading and getting sleepy, I can lay the book down and take a nap. When it looks like the air is soft and beautiful and the sun is shining, I can get up and go for a walk. It's a day that can be anything that delights me. When was the last time you had a day like that? Can you believe that God has given us this and we so rarely find a way to receive it? Isaiah 58 is so clear that if you delight in the Sabbath, I will give you delight. You will delight yourself in me. You will ride upon the heights. The word delight, the concept of delight, is so deeply embedded in a Sabbath practice. And I'll tell you, when you spend a day delighting in God's most basic and good gifts for you, gratitude is not hard and worship is not hard because you are in touch with the goodness of your life. So the gift of delight, delighting in God and God's good gifts, those gifts that money cannot buy. Beautiful part of our gift basket. Now I'm going to take you into the deep weeds for a minute, all right? Here's another gift, and it's a bit more of a challenging one, but this is the gift of freedom from whatever has us in its grip. Ooh. So one of the things that I love about publishing with my publisher, InterVarsity Press, is that we have this thing called a reader process, and that's where the book is written, but then it gets sent out to readers. So the editor reads it and responds, but also at least 3 other readers, and we pick those readers really carefully to make sure that they represent different aspects of the people who will be reading this book. And with Embracing Rhythms of Work and Rest, it was no different. We sent it out to readers, and one of the pieces of feedback that came back was, isn't Sabbath a thing of privilege? Isn't Sabbath just something for affluent white people? Lord, have mercy. I can't just leave that unresponded to. So I put a few more threads into the book, I can tell you, that address this issue. And my answer is an unequivocal no. It was not given to affluent white people. It was given to those who were oppressed, to an oppressed people who were living in bondage. And for them, the Sabbath was given as a sign, symbol, and lived reality of their freedom to live on God's terms for them. So when we think of Sabbath only about ceasing and resting and replenishment, I think we may be selling it short. Because there is this strong element of remembering where we've come from and all that God has brought us through and all the ways that we were in bondage and now God is bringing us into freedom. And so Cole Arthur Riley, in her book, This Here Flesh, which is a lovely book, as an African-American woman, she writes, when we rest, we do so in memory of rest denied. We receive what has been withheld from ourselves and our ancestors, and our present respite draws us into remembrance of those who were not permitted it. When I rest my eyes, I meet those ancestors, and they meet me. As time blurs within it, they tell me to sit back. They tell me to breathe. They tell me to walk away like they couldn't. Rest is an act of defiance. It is the audacity to face the demands of this world and proclaim, we will not be owned. So I want to ask you today, where are you in bondage today? What owns you today that shouldn't be owning you? What owns you other than God? And is there any way in which the Sabbath practice could lead you out of your bondage? Are you in bondage to your ego today, where you just can't stop working because you're trying to impress the world? Sabbath keeping could lead you out of that bondage. Are you in bondage to your cell phone and your apps and all the constant connectivity and information gathering? Sabbath could be the way to lead you out of your bondage. Are you in bondage to people pleasing? Wow. Sabbath could lead you out of your bondage. There are so many ways in which the Sabbath can lead us out of our bondage. I remember being in bondage to my television after COVID and all of that happened, because they would always give all the statistics about who's dying and how many hospitalizations and all the changes and what the protocols were. And for the first time in my life, I was glued to the television. But then when it was all over, I was still glued. And now we were in this rhythm of watching the news every single day, and the political season was really difficult at that time and would get me all riled up, and it felt like bondage to me, like it was a compulsion, like I couldn't stop it. And so I realized, Sabbath could lead me out of this bondage. On Sabbath, we're not going to watch the news. Amen. And so I'm a little freer now because of the practice of Sabbath keeping. So I want to ask you, friends, where are you in bondage today? What owns you that shouldn't be owning you? And can the Sabbath lead you out of your bondage? Again, Cole Arthur Riley says that rest is not the reward for our liberation. It is the path that delivers us there. Hallelujah! It's the path that delivers us there. All right, freedom, the gift of freedom. The gift of remembering, and I want to use this word in a slightly different way here. So the gift of remembering, let me tell you what it is, and then we can sigh together. It's allowing God to put us back together, to help us remember all the parts and pieces of our lives, to remember who we are, whose we are, and a phrase from Abraham Heschel, he talks about Sabbath as being a day to mend our tattered lives. Who needs mending here? Who has anything tattered in your life right now? Who has pieces of yourself all over the place that you got to draw back together because they're just everywhere? The gift of Sabbath is we start to bring the pieces of ourselves back together into one, and we remember who we are. We remember that we are God's. We remember who we belong to. We belong to God more than anybody else or anything else. And we allow God to mend our tattered lives. And I will also say that the mending our tattered lives is something only God can do. I might have awarenesses of how tattered my life is, but I usually don't know what to do about it. But on the Sabbath, somehow God starts stitching stuff back together, and I come out of the Sabbath more whole. A lot more could be said about that, but we'll leave that for now. The gift of belonging, let me tell you about this, and then we can sigh together. The gift of belonging. Sabbath as sign, symbol, and reality that I belong to God, not the culture in which I live. It can be a homecoming of sorts, coming home to myself in God's presence. Wow, what a perfectly chosen gift. So on the Sabbath, after a week of putting out all over the place, I come home to God, the one to whom I truly belong, and the one who loves me beyond all that I do everywhere, for everybody. I find myself beloved. And I have to tell you, friends, that I feel myself loved by God on the Sabbath way differently and way more than I find myself. I feel loved by God right now, but this is not the place where I feel what I feel on the Sabbath. On the Sabbath, I don't get dressed up. I don't put on makeup. I don't say or do things for people very much unless there's an act of kindness that would be a blessing. And on the Sabbath, I just experience being loved for just who I am, this frail little human being that I am. And I get that experience of being loved by God. And so sometimes when I'm challenged, and I'm still challenged by the Sabbath at times, because there are days and weeks when there's so much to do, I can't imagine that I'm going to not do on that seventh day. And as I wrestle with it, and sometimes I even wonder, what am I doing here? While the rest of the world is out there getting stuff done, what am I doing? What's going on here? Everybody else is getting ahead, getting their stuff done, and here I am, resting. But now I have this awareness that I can answer myself with, I am belonging. I am practicing belonging to the one to whom I belong. I am living on God's terms for me. That's really something. That's worth something. I'm living on God's terms for me, whether I believe it or not today, whether or not I think anything's happening today. I am living on God's terms for me, and that settles me right down. There's the gift of being restored, being with God with what is in our lives and allowing God to comfort, guide, heal, refresh, and bless on God's terms for me. Wow, what a cool gift, Sometimes people wonder, why did Jesus do so much healing on the Sabbath? And I think it's because that's the point of Sabbath. Jesus wanted to make sure that the people around him knew that healing is a part of the point of the Sabbath. and that on the Sabbath we are healed in ways that are far beyond medicinal purposes. We are healed in places we didn't even know are wounded, or maybe we know they're wounded. We don't know what else to do with the wound except crawl into God's presence on the Sabbath day and to allow Jesus to heal us. The Jewish people, bless their hearts, had over time begun to miss the point of Sabbath. So they got really angry with Jesus when he would do anything that seemed like work on a Sabbath. And so I believe that Jesus' blatant healing on the Sabbath was actually done way out in the open to be a corrective to those who had started to miss the point of Sabbath. That Sabbath is a day for healing. Jesus says, I haven't done away with the Sabbath. I'm reframing it. I'm the Lord of the Sabbath, and I'm taking it back to what it was meant to be. I'm taking it back to God's purposes for it. So I believe that Jesus was actually not making a mistake by healing on the Sabbath. He was actually doing it quite intentionally through his example, teaching us that healing is a part of what happens on the Sabbath. So as we close, I'm going to close with a moment of meditation and quiet for us to feel our own longings. But I would be remiss if I did not say that Sabbath is more than just a day, and it's more than just how we practice our weeks and order our weeks here on this earth. Sabbath is actually the goal of all existence. Norman Wiersbe says that the creation of Menuha, which is Sabbath, rest, tranquility, serenity, and peace, is not a divine afterthought, nor should it be viewed as in a passive way, as mere withdrawal from exertion. Menuha, not humanity, completes creation. Sabbath, being the climax of creation, is thus the goal toward which all of our living should move. So friends, there's no such thing as a perfect Sabbath. I want to say that now. There's the effort. There's a good effort. Hebrews 4:9 says, so then a Sabbath rest still remains for the people of God. Still here. He's still holding it out for us, just like he held it out to the Israelites. For those who enter God's rest also cease from their efforts as God did from his. Let us therefore make every effort to enter this rest. This is Hebrews 4. Talk about the thread all the way from Genesis 1 all the way at least through Hebrews 4. And so what I hear here is that Sabbath doesn't have to be perfect, and probably it never will, especially those of us with young children or caring for aging parents or other demands in our lives. There will be many times when the Sabbath is not exactly as we had hoped it would be. And we might also even feel like it was not even what God wanted it to be for us on that day. But I love Hebrews 4 because it says, make every effort. Don't try to make the perfect Sabbath, just make the effort. And I believe that God will bless that effort. And that has been my experience again and again and again. And that's the blessing I want for us all. So I'd like to close us with a moment of just being with our longing and being with whatever is being stirred up. In the book, I added a section to each and every chapter, what your soul wants to say to God. And I wonder, what does your soul want to say to God in response to what you've heard today? And not just what you've heard, but what you know to be true. I mean, I spoke from Scripture. I've spoken from our Christian tradition, our Judeo-Christian tradition. It's not just about what I've said. It's that this is there for us. It's just a fact. And so how do you respond to this invitation from God today? And I'm going to read a little bit of poetic lines, and we'll just let this take us down to a quiet place as we conclude. The poem is called On Time. There have to be times in your life when you move slow, times when you walk rather than run, settling into each step. There have to be times when you stop and gaze admiringly at loved ones, marveling that they've been given to you for this life. Times when hugs linger and kisses are real. When food and drink are savored with gratitude and humility rather than gulped down on your way to something else. There have to be times when you read for the sheer pleasure of it, marveling at the beauty of words and the endless creativity in putting them together. Times when you settle into the comforts of home and become human once again. There have to be times when you light a candle and find the tender place inside you that loves or sorrows or sings, and you pray from that place. Times when you let yourself feel when you allow the tears to come rather than blinking them back because you don't have time to cry. There have to be times to sink into the soft body of yourself and love what you love simply because love itself is a grace. Times when you sit with gratitude for the good gifts of your life that get lost and forgotten in the rush of things. Times to celebrate and play, to roll down hills, to splash in water and make leaf piles, to spread paint on paper or walls or each other. There have to be times to sit and wait for the fullness of God that replenishes body, mind, and soul. There has to be time for the fullness of time, or time is meaningless.
Wow. You truly are a teacher of formation. Every time I get so much to think about. But I have to start here. You're a flaming pea. There's a point, I promise, to the question. So the Myers-Briggs, that means that unstructured, unplanned,
Spontaneous. Leaving my options open.
Right.
Yeah. Not much scheduling.
Right. But in my experience, if I don't, there's an old cliche. If you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And so for me, keeping Sabbath, I have to really schedule, plan. I do all this.
Yes.
How does that work for you as someone who isn't natural with that?
Yeah. Well, I've gotten better at this over the years, but I have to be aware of what needs to be done before I can enter in and stop everything. And so I might not do it in a bing, 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 bing way. I might take off in my car and do 7 things in an order that unfold,
right.
And it often does. But it's not a straitjacket. But I do know these things need to be done before the Sabbath, or they will not be done. And so those things that simply must be done have to be done.
Right.
So I might do them. It feels good to do it in more of a relaxed way than, like shoving a trip to the grocery store in the middle of the workday. It feels nice to just get in the car with a little list of things that need to be done and just take off and do them.
Yeah.
It feels very good to be human, I will say. I actually enjoy that day. Around the Transforming Center, we call it our Human Day. It's a day to be human. And I actually really appreciate the experience of feeling like a human and just doing those things that have to do with sustaining my humanity. There's something very rich and life-giving. We just love our human days. The fact that that's how we work, too. We do not bother each other on the weekends, so we all know that we have our human day and then our Sabbath day. And it feels really good, actually, to pay attention to that part of myself after a week that's often lived on another level.
Yeah, so that scheduling for you is kind of zen. You kind of flow when that.
Yes, I do.
See, I'm a J. I'm a flaming J.
I have J's around me, and I know my husband's a J. Of course, that's
yes.
the way marriage always works.
That's right.
Is that you marry you marry what you need is really what it is.
Is that what it is?
I
okay.
hope so.
Oh, well, I know I did. Okay, so I have to show you this. You know what I have here. So I got this. So because there was an advance, thing that IVP did, these boxes got set out. It's a Sabbath box. It came with a candle.
Yes.
I've burnt it. It came with matches. I didn't know they still made them.
Yeah. And what's on that little what is on that little thing? That place to strike it. Is there a place to strike it on there?
No, I didn't get
Here,
that.
Let me see this. It's on the bottom.
Oh.
You can strike it.
Oh.
There's a little thing here.
I didn't.
I'm so glad we discussed this.
It is, and I didn't use the match. So my first question, though, is because I got this, am I one of the elect?
Yes.
Is that what I want to go?
So yes, I think
that's what that means.
But what happened, of course, immediately is that people were like, "Are these for sale? Can we buy these?" And of course, we didn't do it that way. So
right, yeah.
So no, they're not. I mean, in that way,
this one is $10,000. My own unused matches. Yes. So okay. So I'm a flaming J. And so I schedule and structure. I put this in the box.
Oh yeah, that's
so there you
impressive.
Go. So doesn't that look like a J doing that?
It does.
I mean, read some of the things on there.
Don't work. Engage in spiritually enriching activities. But if you don't want to, you don't have to.
Don't judge me.
Okay.
Go.
Prepare for it, yes, and no tech, yes.
No tech.
Yes, no tech. So, and then you've got some things here. It feels like a very intimate list, but I do see that you have, you're very specific about what would bring you joy and what needs to be done beforehand.
Yeah.
That's really great. I mean, that's very, very excellent.
So that's affirmation.
Yeah, that is. You're a Gold
Okay.
Star Sabbath student.
Phew. That's
I know that's why you had
really
to come.
what I wanted to do. Okay, so you at the end you touched on the misuse, right? The Pharisees who seemed to not get what it was. Jesus came and corrected that. That's always the challenge for me is, I heard a quote, it's kind of stuck with me this year. The person who's the most disciplined is the person who's the most free. So I understand, like I know that when people are pretty disciplined, they're pretty strict with things, and there's a kind of freedom that comes within that. And yet at the same time, that strictness that can become, how do you balance that? Because I get the feel, when I read this marvelous book, by the way, do get this, Embracing Rhythms of Work and Rest, I got the feeling that you've really lived into this, like you've gone up against that challenge. So speak to us about that, because that's the hard thing for me is I want to be strict and disciplined, don't know this, know that, and yet I don't want to become a Pharisee.
Yeah, two things. One is the word rhythm. Let's just use the word rhythm rather than discipline or practice. I really, anybody who's read my work knows that I love the idea of rhythm because rhythm has more give and take to it, more flow, and there's so many beautiful things in our world, like the tides, the seasons, that are just, they're gorgeous. And so nobody has to tell you to be attracted to them. You just are. And our bodies are created to live in rhythms too. So if I'm not aware that lunch is gone, my body will tell me. Lunch was at, it's 2 o'clock. Lunch is supposed to be eaten at 12, and your body knows it. It's a rhythm. And it's a rhythm that keeps us alive. The rhythm of our hearts, the rhythm of our brain waves, the rhythm of our breathing. All of those keep us alive. And so I really love the idea of rhythms for this, that Sabbath is a rhythm. It is not a rigid discipline, but it is a rhythm. So that helps me right there to live into it. Because think about the rhythm of just lying in the ocean and letting the waves just kind of cradle you. Giving yourself to it. I mean, that's what the Sabbath, give yourself to the rhythm, and pretty soon it'll be in your body. Your mind won't even think it anymore. So I will be very honest and say there are times when life is very busy and I'm like, okay, I think I'm going to try to do a little work on Sunday. I've got a deadline or something like that. I'm going to try to do a little work. And I used to be able to cheat like that. Cheating myself. That's what I mean, is that I was cheating myself. Yeah. And now, even though the thought might be there that I'm going to work a little bit on the Sabbath, my body never takes me there. It won't allow it anymore. I've been practicing for so long that my body just doesn't take me there. It won't go there anymore on the Sabbath because it's so in there. So rhythm is one thing, get into your body. But then the second one, I want to mention the word desire. That I think the idea of desire takes us beyond oughts and shoulds and this is what I have to do to be a good Christian, but instead I get back down to my desire, and this is what I encourage in others as well as a spiritual director, that whenever one of the disciplines is feeling, or one of the practices is feeling old or stifling or like a straitjacket or something like that, I will say, let it go for a while, and let's get back in touch with your desire. What is your desire? Because, and here's the good thing is that each of the spiritual practices is meant to correspond to one of the heart's deepest desires.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and so what the Sabbath draws me because I have a desire for rest. I have a desire for a way of life that works, and I believe that the Sabbath is part of a way of life that works, and I want that so deep down. I want it. So I don't ever let the Sabbath become something that feels like a legalistic straitjacket. It's what I want. It's what I want more than anything. Yeah. So if I'm getting out of rhythm, then I go back to my desire and I remember, what is it that I really want? I really want a way of life that works, and I know that when I'm practicing Sabbath, my life is working.
Amen to that. Yeah, leading with the wants, not the have to, but I want to.
Exactly.
That's why I thought your stuff today about the gifts, I just want to keep my mind on that. And I think also as a leader, when you're trying to encourage others, start with that. Like start with the gifts, not the, here's what you have to do, and it'll be a bummer. But start with, here's the gift.
Right.
So good.
Yeah.
So good. Thank you for your work. Thank you for the teaching.
Thanks for inviting me
Thanks
in.
for being here. We've got workshops coming up, but Jacob's going to come up and give us some instructions. But let's give thanks to Ruth Haley Barton for teaching us today.